Yeah, I think I would say at the outset, Bongani, that most of the experts around the world got this result horribly wrong. So this should really impose some humility on all of us who are trying to unpack exactly what happened. But I think, this result really reflects what America is, not what we imagine America to be, not the cinematic version of America, the West Wing, with all its soaring ideals and famous statesmen. I mean, the America today is a country that largely votes on parochial bread and butter concerns. How much money do we have at the end of the month? Is my job safe? Are things likely to get better or worse for my family? That's not a value judgment. That's just a reality. And I think we have to understand that first in terms of unpacking what happened a couple nights ago.
There is a view that for its voters, the Republican Party is the gift that keeps on giving. They do what they say they will. Whereas part of the strategy here for the Democrats was to almost go GOP light, if you will, hoping to flip some of those voters. It didn't work, did it?
No, it didn't work. And what the Democrats didn't understand is that really how simple it was. What needed to happen was to create the impression that America was going to the dogs and thus change was needed. So forget about what the reality was, what the real economic metrics, which paint a much better picture of America in terms of the problems it faces, high inflation, rising house prices, general feelings of insecurity. That type of stuff is felt around the world. But what the Democrats didn't realize is that they had to counter that impression, and they weren't successful in doing it.
One of her last campaign stops in front of, you might argue, a friendly audience on The View, that television program, she was asked, Kamala Harris, what she might do differently from her boss Joe Biden, and essentially said not a thing. I mean, she remained tethered to a president that we were getting a sense was now quite unpopular, with many of those Americans believing the country was headed in the wrong direction.
Yeah, Balgani, I actually think none of that really matters. I mean, we all know that Kamala Harris crushed it in the debate. She beat Donald Trump decisively. She performed incredibly admirably, considering that she only had a run of about 100 days. So we can unpack this however we want, but the reality is that 3.5% more Americans voted for Trump than they did for Harris. And none of these little matters or hiccups were going to matter. I think essentially this thing was set in stone quite some time ago.
One podcaster put it thus, and I quote now: he can't say enough things to be racist. He can't commit enough crimes to be a criminal. He can't fail enough times to be a failure. A Christian savior who doesn't know the Bible but sells them anyway. He steals from charities. He's a serial philanderer. It's a masterclass in white privilege. How much of that was a factor here, that America, in a sense, remains a deeply racist and misogynistic society?
Well, I think that's certainly one of the reasonable arguments that people can make. But, you know, Trump, the fact is that tens of millions of Americans voted for a person who they would probably not allow to babysit their kids, who they would not allow to be the teacher of their son or daughter, who they wouldn't want as their boss, they wouldn't want as their bank manager. The reality is this was very much a referendum on the Democrats as much as it was a vindication for Trump. And Trump is regarded as an almost mythic, godlike figure, as a presidential candidate who can inflict pain on the Democrats and return America, make it great again. But on a personal level, in terms of his character flaws, it's not like people don't see that. And that's not what they voted for. This was very much, as I said, a referendum on the Democrats in the sense that the country was going to the dogs and they needed change.
Explain what Project 25 is to South Africans who may not even have heard of it. And does this clean sweep, getting the House, getting the Senate, does it mean now the GOP can enact its program fully?
Well, Project 2025, it's a massive, I think, 920-page document that was put out by the Heritage Foundation, which is regarded as a blueprint for American society under Trump. And it touches on everything from abortion restrictions, parental choice on schooling, much stronger border restrictions on immigration, more executive control over the bureaucracy. It kind of makes for a terrifying read. Now, it's important to say that it is not recognized as official Trump policy, but it is seen to be that. And of course, it strikes fear in the minds of Democrats who feel they haven't just lost an election, they feel like it's the end of the world. But whether or not he's actually going to be able to implement this, even with control of the Senate and the House, remains to be seen. And I would leave your listeners with this thought. We think about the American deep state and we think about, Kerry Washington and the fixer. But the reality is the deep state in America is the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy is massive. And the bureaucracy can slow roll quite a lot of things. So Donald Trump can't just snap his finger and he changes U.S. military overseas engagements. I mean, the U.S. military employs nearly 3 million people. So the bureaucracy can fight back, as it were. It can counter some of the more dramatic policies that the administration tries to implement. But there's no doubt that he has a very strong hand if he controls all of these branches.
Internationally, I mean, is there any world leader, I suppose, happier than Benjamin Netanyahu? And where does this leave someone like Volodymyr Zelensky?
Well, I think that we probably overstate exactly how international leaders regard what has happened. There's no doubt there is a sense that a Trump administration wants to disrupt the global order, but the global order was already somewhat fragile. And remember, maintaining policy coherence internationally can be very, very difficult because although lots of Republicans are totally on board with Trump's domestic agenda, they may disagree with him entirely on Putin, on Russia, on NATO. So it's not like he's going to have an entirely free hand internationally. And I
Right.
think people recognize that this was already baked in. They knew that they would have to work with him. They've worked with him before and they survived. So they'll have to do it again.
So, how should Cyril Ramaphosa read all of this in light of two considerations? A, our International Court of Justice actions in terms of that genocide case against Israel. And of course, we get to host the G20 next year. I mean, and that means Trump is going to be here, right?
Yes, there is a tendency on South Africa and Africa to overplay the significance of whether it's a Democrat or Republican in power. The most important point I would leave you with is the general decline, the general attenuation in African interests, including South African interests, really since the 1980s. And this is a real problem, is that South Africa is drifting further down the agenda. Now, everyone wants to know, of course, about AGOA and whether or not it's going to be canceled. The reality is, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican African official, they don't want to boot out South Africa out of AGOA. They want a very pragmatic stance towards the most important geopolitical power on the continent. But the reality is that if South Africa does not get someone in Washington who understands how DC works, how US politics is going to work under Trump, it's very likely that they will get booted out of AGOA, because you'll simply just have to throw South Africa under the bus because it's being perceived as a country that is prejudicing U.S. interests. And so in terms of Ramaphosa, I don't think it matters as much as people assume, whether it's a Democrat or whether it's a Republican.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Appreciate your analysis. Dr. Terence McNamee is a writer and consultant, and of course, part of the Global Fellow of the Wilson Center in DC.
Current events, developing stories,
tough questions.
Your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.